Also this morning, the U.S. Supreme Court upholding birthright citizenship, ruling against the Trump administration and the president's executive order, upholding that children born in the U.S., whether they are born to people who are in the country unlawfully or temporarily, are granted birthright citizenship. Friend of the program, Robert Bolton from Fairmont State University, has been following all this very closely, and he can help break down some of the legal nuts and bolts this morning. Robert, good morning. Busy morning this morning.
Oh, very much, Dave, and good morning to you.
So let's start actually with birthright citizenship. This came down right in the middle of our discussion with the state attorney general. This was a 5-4 decision with Justices Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett joining with Kagan, Jackson, and Sotomayor. So what was the majority opinion in this case?
Well, in the birthright citizenship case, Trump v. Barbara, they ended up ruling that children who are born to parents who are here illegally or who are otherwise not domiciled are generally going to be considered from birth citizens of the United States. The only significant exceptions would be those who are the children of diplomats and those who are, say, you had an invading force, so the children of soldiers, if there was an insurrection or invasion in the United States.
So, Robert, this executive order now struck down by the Supreme Court. If I may oversimplify this, the Supreme Court kind of said in the majority opinion the 14th Amendment says what the 14th Amendment says. Is that an oversimplification?
Not entirely. I mean, when you and I actually met the day after Trump was sworn in office last year, January 21st, and my prediction at that time was very similar to what ended up happening, that this case was always going to be a long shot. There are some legal scholars who argued that based off of that clause within the 14th Amendment that says subject to the jurisdiction thereof, that people who had removed themselves from the laws of the United States by coming into the country illegally were not entitled to the benefits of citizenship or their children born here. But yeah, this opinion, I think, shocks no one. From the beginning, it was always going to be a long shot. Prior Supreme Court precedent from U.S. v. Juan Kim Ark, a case out of the 1890s, up through to today, has pretty much always treated people whose children are either A, domiciled here, or B, who the parents are here illegally. Their children are still issued passports and treated as citizens. This really doesn't shock anyone in particular. I will admit I was a little bit surprised that you ended up having Justice Gorsuch join the dissenters, but I had expected Alito and Thomas would be the only two dissenters in general on this opinion, so I can't say I'm especially surprised. Kavanaugh's also a little bit unusual because he joined in the majority decision, but he ended up dissenting in part. But again, this case really, I don't think, shocked anyone. After oral arguments occurred on April 1st, when President Trump notably appeared during oral argument, you could tell from the line of questioning that the justices generally were pretty skeptical. And even President Trump himself, on his social media comments on Truth Social after the oral arguments, seemed to recognize and read the tea leaves that it was unlikely that his executive order was going to stand.
Fairmont State University professor Robert Bolton joining us this morning. Robert, what was the reasoning behind the dissenting opinions?
Well, the reasoning behind the dissenting opinions was their argument was generally that I should clarify that the majority opinion basically said, look, under the old English common law, British subjects or people who were born within British territory, their children were presumptively treated as subjects of the king. The dissenting opinion, and probably if one of our listeners was going to read only one, it would be Justice Thomas's that you would want to read. They argue that the law was actually a bit more nuanced on that generally people who were not agreeing to be subject to the national authority of the United States should not be considered citizens. Also, generally, Justice Thomas felt that when it came to it, the difference between under the 14th Amendment protecting former slaves, people who were born in this country and who would have no other homeland, is that people who come to this country and have children do in fact already have citizenship with another country. Indeed, the woman who is the main person in this class action, Barbara, that's her pseudonym, is actually already a Honduran citizen. So Justice Thomas was saying, look, if we say Ms. Barbara's children are not U.S. citizens at birth, they are still going to have Honduran citizenship because their mother is a Honduran citizen. This isn't really relevant to this particular case, but there is also a principle under international law that a country is not supposed to leave people within its territory without any type of nationality. So that was one thing where Justice Thomas wanted to make sure that we were not violating international law principles. But those are the big arguments. And then there are other minor details where he argues that the record in the congressional globe when the 14th Amendment was being debated and the details of the English common law were actually a bit more nuanced than the majority opinion depicted. But again, I think, to be blunt, Justice Thomas is probably stretching. The historical evidence pretty heavily weighed in favor of birthright citizenship. Again, I'm not defending or criticizing it as a policy matter, but as a matter of the historical record, the precedent leaned pretty heavily in favor of the majority opinion in this case.
Fairmont State University professor Robert Bolton, friend of the program, joining us. Robert, let me toss this question at you, a little bit of a curveball, but the Supreme Court has taken criticism mainly from the left of rubber stamping being packed with conservatives, rubber stamping Trump administration policies. The Trump administration won some, they lost some in this term. Does that criticism fall by the wayside? If you are looking at this objectively, does that fall by the wayside given the fact that, again, Trump administration won some, they lost some in this term of the Supreme Court?
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely. I think that the court is very mindful of its image of independence and probably is, quite frankly, the one branch of government that still is mostly independent of the president's impact in a way that certainly the U.S. Congress, both houses of it, is not. Yeah, you've seen occasions today. One case we haven't discussed is the voting rights case out of in regard to election spending, but you've seen the justices Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh in this term in each instance have cases where Trump heavily favored one side, and those justices appointed by him ended up ruling or voting in the opposite direction. Certainly in this birthright citizenship case, for example, Kavanaugh and Barrett both sided with the majority conclusion, which is certainly not what the president was favoring. So, yeah, it's unsurprising. Yeah, most of the time conservative justices are going to vote in a way that a conservative president favors, but they are not doing so because the president is dictating that they do so. They are doing so because that is what their ideology favors.
Crazy morning. Lots going on this morning, Robert. A lot to digest today.
Very much so. I mean, there were other cases. I just called in a moment ago, so I'm not sure if you discussed the transgender athlete case.
Spent about an hour on that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, again, that was a hugely important one. I'm not sure what some of your other speakers discussed about it, but that was one that was very interesting from a federal law perspective. But, yeah, this is the last day of the Supreme Court for this term. I think they did save those controversial ones for the very end. because with summer vacation, it allows some of that controversy to die down and certainly allows the justices to flee Washington and the people trying to buttonhole them after these decisions come out. But this has certainly been a very consequential term from the perspective of a constitutional law scholar's perspective.
Robert, I thought that the ban on transgender athletes case there was interesting in that it wasn't just a straight down the line on ideological differences. There was actually some crossover there with what you would term, the liberal judges. Sotomayor, certainly not going to be confused as a conservative, joining with the majority, at least partly joining with the majority. And then J.B. McCuskey broke it down as basically a 9-0 decision on the Title IX question in that case. So that was interesting to me that was not a clean break along ideological lines.
Yes, very much so. I mean, Justice Kavanaugh was the one who wrote the majority opinion. But, yeah, you had Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Barrett all joined him in whole. Thomas and Gorsuch filed their concurring opinions. Sotomayor, like you said, again, an appointee of Barack Obama, concurred in the judgment. Now, she did file a partial dissent that Kagan and Jackson joined. But even Justice Jackson ended up joining in part in the judgment and dissenting in part. And the key thing to look at is they were basically taking a very narrow view of the federal law at play here, and also in regard to whether or not sex is protected under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And they basically said, look, there was a similar case from 2020, Bostock v. Clayton County, that said that in cases where someone is, say, born biologically male but identifies as female, that's a gender expression and you can't discriminate against them in the workplace. But that involves one individual. When, on the other hand, you have a case where you have someone who's biologically male, as in the case with Becky Pepper Jackson, but identifies as female, they are competing against girls in women's athletics. So the question isn't just how are you treating that individual, but how does this impact other female athletes within the athletic arena? And some people at the lower levels and in some opinion pieces have said, well, maybe we look at, does this transgender individual, when have they been on hormone replacements or hormone blockers? And basically what the Supreme Court said is if you try to do that, it's going to be impossible on a case-by-case basis to make a medical evaluation of whether or not this person's biological sex gives them an unfair competitive advantage. And so states that have passed legislation saying, no, you have to compete within the gender that you are biologically born as, rather than what you identify as, is constitutionally permissible. But it is important to remember, though, this did not say categorically you had to ban students. This is left up as a matter of federalism to individual state discretion. 27 states have taken the opinion, or I believe it was 27 states have taken the opinion of banning biological males from female sports, but there are 23 states, including California, that have passed laws explicitly either allowing it or guaranteeing transgender individuals are allowed into those sports.
Leaving it up to the states.
Definitely an unusual case.
Yeah, leaving it up to the states. What a novel concept here in this country.
Yeah,
imagine
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, well, and hey, that's what our Constitution is intended for. Justice Louis Brandeis once said, let states be laboratories of democracy. Let them come up with innovative solutions, see what works best, what's a fair result, and hopefully in the long term, democracy can be an ugly, messy process, but hopefully it'll come up with an equitable, just solution for everybody in the long term.
Friend of the show, Fairmont State University professor Robert Bolton. Robert, always appreciate the context. Thank you so much.
No problem, David. Thank you for having me on. Very much enjoyed this discussion.
Absolutely. Me as well. We'll get some of your comments at 304-TALK, 304-800-765-TALK, 800-765-8255. That is the phone number.